It's 4 p.m. on Monday, September 1st, here in Korea. Live from Seoul, I'm Laah Hyun-kyung. We begin this afternoon with the latest from North Korea. The regime reinforced the notion this morning that it will not hesitate to carry out provocations without notice. Pyongyang fired off another short-range projectile into the East Sea earlier on this Monday. An official at South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff says it had a range of around 220 kilometers and that no prior warning was given. The South Korean official adds it marks the first time the regime has fired a short-range projectile from its northwestern province of Jagang-do, that's just 60 kilometers from its border with China. Now, recent South Korean media reports of a U.S. official making a trip to Pyongyang have many wondering if Washington has changed its North Korea policy. The White House says no, but could there be subtle signs of a slight shift? Our Choi Yoo-sun has more.
Washington is sticking with its policy of not engaging with North Korea just for the sake of holding talks. In a written statement to South Korea's Yonhap News, National Security Council spokesperson Patrick Van Trell said the U.S. is open to dialogue with the North, but will decide on re-engaging with the regime based on its actions and not words. By actions, the spokesperson said Pyongyang would need to show it's sincere about ending its nuclear weapons development and that it's ready to fulfill past commitments. Unconfirmed reports of an informal meeting between U.S. and North Korean officials in Pyongyang and the North Korean foreign minister's attendance at the UN General Assembly later this month have fueled speculation of renewed dialogue between the two sides. There's something to make out of Washington's statement, especially as it comes after its informal civilian meeting with North Koreans in May. The Obama administration may have decided to maintain its North Korea policy following that contact. On the other hand, the NSC spokesperson urging the North to use a New York-based channel instead of civilian routes to communicate with the U.S. deserves some attention. Washington's soon-to-be-appointed six-party talks envoy Sidney Seiler, the post in charge of the New York channel, could seek to better utilize it. The Obama administration can certainly make use of that channel to control North Korea's provocative behavior ahead of midterm elections in November. And the three Americans detained in the North, widely speculated to have been the purpose of the reported trip to Pyongyang by an American official, could force the U.S. to seek negotiations. Choi Yoo-sun, Arirang News.
And all this comes while Pyongyang hosted a pro wrestling event over this past weekend. Foreign sports stars and loud cheers were seen and heard in the capital. North Korea watchers say the event may improve bilateral ties between Pyongyang and Tokyo. Our Son Jung-in tells us more.
The crowd cheers as renowned names from the wrestling world like Bob Sapp and Jerome Le Banner take to the ring. The last time Pyongyang hosted a pro wrestling competition like this was in April 1995. Foreign media reported on the event taking a greater interest in the changes they have noticed in the state, such as its developed infrastructure and increasingly savvy spectators.
This is the first time I've watched such an event. It was very impressive. I hope these friendly games take place more often for the sake of unity.
Some American visitors were in attendance, including Pras Michel, who co-founded the hip-hop group The Fugees.
The infrastructure seemed really good for a third world country. You know,
at least what we're allowed to see.
Right. Well, yeah, exactly.
With guests like Pras Michel, who is a friend of U.S. President Barack Obama, some speculate it was North Korea's move to improve its international relations, but experts view it as an ordinary sports diplomacy event that Pyongyang has been holding for a long time.
The move is seen as North Korea's way to show that its young leader is active and friendly to the people by hosting athletic events.
In line with the competition, Antonio Inoki, a Japanese wrestler turned lawmaker who co-hosted the event, met with North Korea's ceremonial head of state Kim Yong-nam over the weekend. They are believed to have exchanged views on Japanese nationals who were abducted by North Korean agents in the 1970s and 80s. 손정인, Arirang News.
A regular parliamentary session began on this Monday here in South Korea. The main rival parties are tasked with breaking the stalemate over the much contested ferry bill in order to deliberate on dozens of other bills that have been sitting idle on lawmakers' desks. Our National Assembly correspondent Kim Myung-gil has this report.
Korea's rival parties have been locking horns for months over a special bill designed to uncover the causes of April's ferry accident. Extraordinary sessions were held in July and August, but not a single bill was passed amid the bipartisan wrangling.
The regular parliamentary session must meet the needs of the people. We must work on next year's budget plans and pass bills related to improving the livelihoods of the people.
The ruling Saenuri Party and the main opposition New Politics Alliance for Democracy have on two separate occasions reached agreements on the ferry bill. But in both cases, the main opposition party quickly backtracked amid backlash from the victims' families.
The Saenuri Party and the victims' families must reach a compromise over the Seoul ferry bill. The New Politics Alliance for Democracy has been persistent in its efforts to enact a special bill.
Relatives demand that the committee tasked with looking into the ferry disaster are given full investigative powers. It's a demand that the ruling party has been unwilling to meet. In attempts to break the impasse, Saenuri Party floor leader Lee Wang-gu will hold a third round of talks with the victims' families on Monday. The prolonged political standoff could affect the government's 2015 budget proposal. Next year's spending bill has to be passed by the end of November, or the government risks starting the year with a provisional budget. And with Korea's Chuseok holiday coming next week, the rival parties are under even more pressure to make progress in the coming days. Kim Myung-gil, Arirang News.
In order to make the nation more eco-friendly and carbon-free, one of the things needed in the future will be more electric vehicles. And experts say in order for that to happen, the costs need to be cut from somewhere. Our Hwang Ji-hye has this week's Industry Insight.
Electric cars are still too pricey compared to their counterparts relying on combustion engines that few want to buy one. The key to slashing the price and luring more consumers to this emission-free auto market is cutting the costs of the battery, which accounts for 40% of the car's total price. So could the electric car era hit anytime soon? Take a look.
By 2020, more than 10 million eco-friendly vehicles powered by batteries are expected to be on the roads.
And this industry of tomorrow is taking root here in Korea with a couple of local companies spearheading the global electric car battery market.
Korean makers LG Chem and Samsung SDI are expected to make up half the electric car battery market share this year. LG Chem recently won a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars from Audi, raising the number of its global customers to 20. They include General Motors, Ford, Renault, and Hyundai. Samsung SDI supplies batteries to BMW. Japan was the pioneer for electric car batteries, but experts say Korean firms are better positioned at this point.
The competitive edge of local battery makers has strengthened since developing batteries for mobile phones and other home appliances. Based on that, they're now building up their technology for batteries in electric and hybrid vehicles.
Battery life is not necessarily the main stumbling block anymore. Companies already have the technology to develop a battery that can run around 320 kilometers on a single charge, more than enough for a normal daily drive for most commuters. But the key in building a big enough electric car market is driving down the price. So the name of the game is to secure a system of mass production, and little wonder battery makers are vying to strike deals with as many automakers as possible as their customers.
The electric car market is still in its early stages, so once battery makers establish business relationships with automakers, it's likely to continue for decades. It's important to secure deals, although they might face losses for now.
The race to win more customers is heating up. The biggest competitor, Panasonic, has teamed up with American electric car maker Tesla to build a massive battery factory in the U.S. It's a big leap by the Japanese battery maker, and the fierce rivalry should ensure the era of electric cars will come sooner than we ever thought possible. Hwang Ji, Arirang News.
On to the stories you just saw. Samsung Group's shipbuilding and engineering units have announced that they will merge before the year's end as the nation's top conglomerate speeds up its restructuring drive. Samsung Heavy Industry and Samsung Engineering say they will proceed with the merger with a stock ratio of 2.36 Samsung Heavy Industries shares per one Samsung Engineering share. The units say that this will provide a synergy effect in designing, purchasing, and managing onshore as well as offshore plants. Now, the company hopes the merger, set to be completed by December 1st, will boost their revenue to a combined $40 billion by the year 2020. That's up 60% from last year. Korean exports slipped a bit last month from a year earlier. The Trade Ministry says outbound shipments stood at $46.2 billion in August. That's down 0.1% from the same period last year. The drop was attributed to a fewer number of working days and less output in the auto sector due to summer vacations. Imports went the other direction, though, last month, up 3% to nearly $43 billion, putting the trade surplus for August at more than $3 billion. Now, adding to reports of Apple's iPhone 6 possibly being unveiled at an upcoming media event slated for September 9th, there are now reports that the American tech giant is making headway on its plans to turn them into mobile wallets. Sources tell Bloomberg that Apple is in talks with Visa, MasterCard, and American Express to partner in its mobile payment system that conceptually would allow users to pay with their phone at the cash register using NFC or near-field communication technology and the phone's fingerprint recognition reader. Even if it strikes a deal, reports add Apple would still need to convince U.S. retailers to adopt the technology, as it's unclear which retailers have agreed to join Apple's new plan. Now, back here in Korea, farmers recently had to fight off billions of locusts in their fields in the south of the country, making them anxious as they prep for the upcoming Korean Thanksgiving holiday. Authorities say the situation is now under control, but scientists warn that a repeat appearance is not out of the question. Our Kwon So-ah reports.
Locust Attack. Fields of reeds and crops in Korea's southern Jeollanam-do province have been stripped by swarms of bugs. But thankfully, the worst is thought to be over now. Officials say pest control successfully eradicated the infestations over the weekend.
It took 2 days to find an environmentally friendly chemical, and that's why the locusts destroyed 8 to 9 hectares of my land in a week.
The swarms damaged roughly 100,000 cubic meters of agricultural land, nibbling on every edible leaf and making harvest time hard for farmers ahead of the Chuseok holiday, otherwise known as the Korean Thanksgiving. The insects, which range in size from 50 millimeters to 4 centimeters long, were identified as migratory locusts, which can grow up to 6.5 centimeters.
They don't seem to be Chinese grasshoppers. They are migratory locusts that also live in Korea. Usually they are green, but as they changed into group types, they became black.
Experts believe their sudden appearance was due to underground eggs hatching after recent rain.
Until the ecosystem stabilizes, scientists warn there is a good chance that the locusts may reappear, and they've called for observation and countermeasures to address the problem. Kwon So-ah, Arirang News.
Bringing you the fresh updates from stories breaking in Korea and abroad. We give you a bigger and better picture of the world. Join Laah Hyun-kyung live from Seoul. Every weekday, only on Arirang.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has called for a statehood of the battle-hit southeast of Ukraine. U.S. senators say Washington should provide weapons to Kiev to help it in its fight against pro-Russian rebels. Here's our Connie Kim with the latest.
There are increased calls among U.S. politicians to begin arming Ukraine in its fight against what they're calling a Russian invasion. Robert Menendez, the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said Russian President Vladimir Putin must pay for his, quote, aggression. Speaking to CNN, the Democrat said Washington should provide Ukrainians with weapons to defend themselves. Senator John McCain echoed the sentiment and said Putin is trying to restore the Russian Empire. He called for stronger sanctions on Moscow. The comments out of the U.S. came after Putin called for the statehood of eastern and southern Ukraine.
Substantive, meaningful talks concerning not only technical issues but also related to the issues of the society's political organization and statehood in southeastern Ukraine should begin immediately in order to protect legitimate interests of people living there.
President Putin added that Russia as a state could not stand by and do nothing while its people were being shot at by Ukrainian forces. Russia had previously called for federalization that would give greater rights to eastern Ukraine, but this is the first time Putin has called for statehood. Putin's spokesman later insisted that the statement did not amount to an endorsement of the separatist rebels and that only Kiev can reach an agreement with them. Pro-Russian separatists have been gaining ground on Ukrainian forces in eastern and southern Ukraine. The conflict erupted in April following Russia's annexation of Crimea the previous month. Connie Kim, Arirang News.
Thousands of protesters took to the streets of Hong Kong last night after the Chinese Communist Party ruled out open nominations for elections in 2017 that will decide Hong Kong's next chief executive. Pro-democracy activists have vowed to fight for full democracy. Our Park Ji-won has more.
Some 5,000 citizens have taken to the streets of Hong Kong's financial hub, calling for full democracy in the election for its next leader in 2017.
Some officials, who we don't even know how they got chosen in the first place, are telling us Hong Kong people, this place is Beijing's turf. Today I have to tell you this is definitely not true. Hong Kong is Hong Kong people's own turf.
The latest Occupy Central protests, as they are called, were sparked by a ruling out of China's parliament that will allow just 2 to 3 candidates to run for chief executive of Hong Kong in 2017. All of the candidates will first need to gain majority backing from a nominating committee, meaning it will be almost impossible for opposition politicians to even register as candidates.
We have to voice out that we don't agree with the Chinese government's decision. We want democracy. We want to want a fair system to protect the environment of Hong Kong.
Despite the protests, current Hong Kong chief executive is defending Beijing's decision, saying it is a milestone of democratic reform.
Universal suffrage for the CE election through one person, one vote by Hong Kong people is not only a big step forward for Hong Kong, but also a historic milestone.
The Occupy Central protesters see it another way and have promised mass protests against the decision out of Beijing in the weeks and months to come. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
Now, staying in Northeast Asia, Japan's wartime sexual enslavement of Korean women has long been a source of tension between the two neighboring countries. And a Japanese professor says public sentiment on the issue has plunged in Japan following Seoul's rejection of Tokyo's efforts to improve the situation. Our Foreign Affairs Ministry correspondent Hwang Sung-hee has this story.
Japan has done its best to resolve the issue of its wartime sexual enslavement of Korean women, and the Japanese public will not allow for fresh apologies or a higher degree of compensation than was already given. That's the grim outlook put forward by Yasuaki Onuma, a professor of international law at Meiji University and the former director of the Asian Women's Fund. Set up by the Japanese government in 1995, the fund collected private donations and sent compensation to 364 former comfort women in Taiwan, the Philippines, the Netherlands, and Korea, each of whom received roughly $30,000. The government also provided direct funding for medical care for the recipients and issued hand-signed letters of apology from then Prime Minister Tomichi Murayama. In a recent interview with a group of Korean reporters in Tokyo, Onuma said hardline Korean civic groups were largely responsible for the current impasse. He said the Korean Council for the Women drafted for military sexual slavery by Japan harshly criticized the 7 Korean comfort women who decided to accept the money, saying they were once again selling themselves to Japan by taking Japanese cash. Onuma ruled out a revival of the Asian Women's Fund, pointing to the icy public sentiment in Japan. He said many Japanese people feel the country put its greatest efforts into resolving the comfort women issue and was rejected by Korea, adding that similar actions will not be allowed amid the current nationalistic tide in Japan. The Japanese professor said the individual happiness of the comfort women must be prioritized and that the issue should not become entangled in the diplomatic feud between Korea and Japan. Hwang Sung-hee, Arirang News.
Moving on to some arts news, there's always a story and a reason behind an artist's creations, and fashion designers are no exception. Our Im Yoon-hee tells us the story of one of the most influential fashion designers in history, Coco Chanel.
One of the most recognizable brands around the world. Chanel is high fashion. But behind the iconic black and white, the tweed jackets, and the quilted leather handbags is a woman who, like many others, had an idea and was determined to bring her passion to fruition.
The Coco Chanel show has been to 5 other countries, and now we would like to show Seoul the history of Coco Chanel and share her vision with the Korean people.
Gabrielle Chanel, nicknamed Coco, was born in Saumur, France, to a family who sold working clothes around the markets. But she was often out in the fields enjoying nature, which is where one of her first motifs entered her life. Chanel's early works often featured an ear of wheat, an image that took her back to her youth. It's these memories and life experiences that were woven together to define and create the prolific designs of Chanel, such as the 6 years she spent at an orphanage. Early Chanel designs bear a stark resemblance to the uniform she wore at the convent of Aubazine, a place where she became enamored by the image of a star, soon to be another prominent motif. The next couple decades of her life included friends such as Picasso and Misia Sert, along with other social elites, and it's during this time that Chanel started her career in fashion, designing hats. Chanel's romantic relationships brought her into contact with things like the equestrian life, another theme that would continue in her style book, along with tweed, a material that she would use to make one of the most iconic pieces of women's fashion, the Chanel tweed jacket. Gabrielle Chanel traveled around the world, being influenced by the history of the places she'd visit, but she also influenced the lives around her as well, even into the modern day. Chanel became immortalized through works of artists like Andy Warhol. Chanel went against the grain from the very beginning, but behind each creation is a story of the designer and the trials and triumphs of her life. Im Yoon-hee, Arirang News.
afternoon. I'm Michelle Park here with the latest weather update. And it's the time of the year when we have this huge temperature gaps between the mornings to nights. And we're getting the last bit of that summer heat here in Seoul today with temperatures lingering right around 30 degrees. And looking ahead to this first week of September, we're expecting continuous nationwide rain on Tuesday until Wednesday, which should stand to cool things down a bit. And after the rain, we can expect more hot and sunny days with temperatures back into the high 20s. And going over to our temperature readings, Seoul will top out at 30 degrees this afternoon. Meanwhile, the southern cities such as Gwangju and Busan will top out at 30 and 27 degrees. And moving over to other regions, Jeju Island tops over to 26, while Dokdo and Mangkungang is on a bit of a cooler side. Now that's all for now. I'm Michelle Park, and back to you, Hyun-kyung.
And thank you, Michelle, for that. That's all we have for you now. Our next newscast is at 6 p.m. Korea time. I'll see you then.